Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. All right, Ben. So today's topic is flourishing in a VUCA world, Agile, agility, and why it matters. What are we going to talk about today?
So we're going to talk about a couple things today. Today in the podcast, we're going to discuss this idea of VUCA, V-U-C-A, and what it means for business and for the rest of us. We're also going to talk about the notions of agility and agile and what they mean. And we'll also provide some practical examples of agility and agile and related implications for employees and managers, trying to break this stuff down and make it accessible and meaningful to our listeners.
Yeah, so great. So the origins of VUCA and why it's relevant. I mean, does this have anything to do with the Vulcans from Star Trek or something?
Maybe, but I don't think so. So VUCA is an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And as far as I can tell, it has some origins back at the U.S. Army War College, where some social scientists there were trying to figure out what kind of environment their strategic leaders were going to need to operate in. And they had a big conference and got people together, all these different ideas, and came up with this idea of VUCA as a descriptor of the kind of broader geopolitical environment, saying, you know, these strategic leaders are going to need to deal with a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that was back in the early 90s. And so this was kind of a framework for them thinking about the context for leadership at that point. And this idea has kind of become synonymous with overall turbulence and so forth, and has become more and more popularized in the popular business press, trying to describe kind of what outside of the military people are dealing with in running their organizations, both kind of externally, strategically, as well as internally within their organizations.
Yeah, one of the things that I find with a lot of these business topics, I think, industry kind of got to be kind of set in its way. Once you establish some market dominance, say like an IBM or a GM, you kind of just kept the ship going in a certain way. It's like more like steering an aircraft carrier than it is, say, like a little fishing boat or something.
Right.
But then and the origins of VUCA may have, and probably even likely came before the military. It's just, I'd say it got popularized by the military, because especially when we started in these environments. So for those of you that don't know, Ben and I actually met in Afghanistan. So we do have experience in these places, both of us with military backgrounds. But there wasn't like a 1 + 1 = 2 strategic environment in both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
And honestly, not in places like Vietnam and other places. So we had to come up with a paradigm and started fishing in both business and, other literatures from different things. What's the best way forward in these complex, ambiguous environments, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right.
So Ben, as business people start struggling with this stuff, as more competitors, the common term that I see is it's disruption. And if you want to, for a while there, it's like if you wanted to get funding for your startup, you had to use the word disruption. You're like, yada, 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 disruption, give me your cash, right?
That's right.
So with all the disruption that is actually happening with globalization, automation, the digital revolution, a lot of software development, those kinds of pieces, people are looking for something to deal with that. And VUCA is one of the paradigms they use to talk about the environment that a lot of companies, organizations find themselves. So, nonprofits as well.
Absolutely.
So is VUCA increasing, Ben? That's one of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question. And maybe before we talk about that, it's important to think about what are we actually talking about with these different aspects of VUCA, right? So what is volatility? Well, volatility typically refers to a change in the rate of change or the pace of change. So it's this idea that change is not necessarily a linear type of activity, right? So that change is something that happens with more and more of a rapid pace. The amount of change that you experienced last year may not be exactly the same as the amount of change you experienced this year. And that in some instances, is actually more of an exponential relationship. You can look at, for example, the rapid pace of technological advancement and so forth. So that's volatility. Uncertainty is about the unpredictability of the future. And what's interesting is that, at the same time, we have lots of talk about things like predictive analytics and trying to figure out, what trends mean and so forth. But those are still not, crystal balls that help us know exactly what's going to happen. At their very best, those types of tools, predictive analytics and so forth, are, looking at what's happened already and seeing what might happen in the future. So uncertainty is the U. Complexity has to do with the increasing interconnectedness of organizations, the nuanced nature in which markets work, where something may happen in one part of your organization and you have unintended consequences elsewhere. You may have something that happens in one industry that affects another industry in unexpected ways. And then the final piece is ambiguity. And ambiguity is a little different from uncertainty in that ambiguity is more like the fog of war. Whereas uncertainty is an unpredictability about the future, ambiguity is more about, trying to figure out what something means. And the way I like to think about this is it's kind of the phenomenon that happens when you have a bunch of smart people sitting in a room and they're all looking at the same problem. They all have the same data and they come up with individually different solutions to that problem. And here's the thing, all of those solutions seem plausible and seem potentially right. That's ambiguity. So that's how it's a little bit different from uncertainty.
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind with that. So, we work in the consulting space. We have a firm together. And I feel like when I look at other consultants that are out there in the same space we are, there's kind of, I don't know, two food groups that I see there. One, there's, we'll bring in some consultants to do some process improvement, right? And that's all that classic MBA. How fast can we make a widget? How efficient can we do it? How do we do it with less people, right? And then there's kind of that strategic consulting, which is how do we navigate the broader business environment? I mean, I was talking to the CEO of one of our clients yesterday who has two key staff members that are probably going to be leaving. And I remember the frustration in his voice saying like, hey, when is this just going to settle in? So like we talk about the older industry that kind of sets its course and gets going. And lots of times we kind of snidely criticize, these, people, you'll never need more than this minimus RAM for your computer. And like, haha, that guy was really off in left field. Look how short-sighted. But really, it can be hard as an individual to deal with this much change when, at the end of the day, you kind of just want to go home and chillax with your family or kick open a cold beer and have a relaxing afternoon, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you still can do that, of course, but I think it is kind of a sign of maturity in at least today's environment for leadership to think, that it's not so much about looking for the next plateau of stability than it is trying to figure out how can we be continually nimble in this environment, right? And I think that kind of brings us to that question that you posed a little bit ago about, is VUCA really increasing? I think it always kind of feels like it is. I have some data on this from, a study that we did where we got about 1,200 leaders to chime in on what they perceived in terms of levels of VUCA in their environments and some disruptive trends and what they're doing about it. And they said, yeah, we on average expect more VUCA in the next 3 years than we've had in the previous 3 years. So I think it's interesting. A lot of CEOs would probably be nodding their heads quite violently if I read this quote to them. If I said, I did not write this, but this is a quote, and I'll tell you who it was from here in a moment. But this person wrote, "Measured by the external and obvious incidents of its progress, time certainly flies these days. Momentous events come swiftly into view, shoot rapidly by, and with equal speed disappear into the past, crowded out of sight and mind by the successors which tread upon their heels. Nor is this due only to the immediateness with which intelligence is transmitted to the four quarters of the globe, the facility of physical movement, and for the communication of facts and interchange of thought between persons or nations cooperating to a common end. The bequests to us of the last century have accentuated perceptibly the pace of mankind, the making of history." I think a lot of people, the folks we work with and encounter in industry, they probably identify pretty closely with that idea that time certainly flies these days. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, Ben, why don't you tell them when that was written and by who?
Yeah. So this is a quote from the famed maritime strategist, U.S. Navy Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan. And the funny thing is that he wrote this in 1906.
Yeah, for me, the only giveaway was the use of the word bequest.
Yeah.
That's right. Which I think if you just modernize the language a little bit, that'd probably be most of the people that we interact with out in the business space, right?
Yeah, yeah. And, at least in military circles, and if you read some older writings, there's talks of, these ideas of VUCA throughout history. And, so I think that this is something that we've always been wrestling with as humans, always been trying to figure out how we're going to deal with this adversity and change and how we're going to flourish in an ever-changing environment when by our very nature we like stability. And this is just a tension that's always there. I think that at the strategic level, there are some things that will never really change. But I think there is some evidence to suggest that in recent decades, with rapid advancement of technology, globalization, the interconnectedness of our economy, there is some evidence that would suggest that, hey, these times are a little bit different. There is probably more turbulence in some ways than there ever has been. One kind of crude measure of this is just if we look at the Fortune 500 list, which is simply a list that Fortune magazine has done for a number of years now, where they just rank the largest U.S. companies by revenue, just the 500 biggest companies that are headquartered in the U.S. And they started this in 1955. And if you look at that original list in 1955, and then you look at the 2018 list, only 53 remain. So, in other words, since 1955, 89% of those original 500 either went bankrupt, they merged, were acquired, fell off of the list for a year or more. And so it's kind of a crude measure, but it is a general indicator, I think, of volatility at least. Telling us that there is VUCA. There's a lot of change in how organizations are structured, how progress is being made.
I think we have a good friend, Mike Richardson, and he always has a quote about some of this stuff. Oh, do you remember what's that he's always saying about the chaos?
Yeah, so he talks a lot about VUCA and agility and stuff with senior executives, and he has a great way of putting it. He says, it's not about the chaos. It's not about the VUCA necessarily. That's always going to be there, and you need to get used to it. He says it's about your relationship with that chaos that matters. And I think that's a really good way to think about it from an executive standpoint.
Yeah, Ben. So I'd say the best practice or the kind of body of knowledge or, I don't know, business movement, whatever you want to call it, is stuff around what we call agility and agile, right? And the idea is like, well, okay, well, if we live in a VUCA world, a VUCA environment, well, what do we do, right? And so, like, how do we thrive and like adapt and live in that chaos and not go nuts, and be able to have something that resembles mental health, right? So, I know that you published a paper with another one of our friends in the Society for Industrial.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. So the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, of which I'm a member and fairly active, they asked me to write a white paper about agility. And the reason that they asked me that was every year they do a listing of kind of what their members see as the top 10 trends in industry, the top big things to watch out for in the workplace. And for the past several years, one of them has been creating agile organizations. And so they said, let's do some white papers on these things, get some information out there to help people. And so they asked me to write this white paper. And so I wrote this with my good friend and doctoral student, Scott Bible, and we explored this idea and tried to put it in layman's terms. And we'll put a link up to this in the show notes so people can have access to it. It's easily accessible on the web. Just talking about this idea of VUCA, but more specifically, how do we deal with it? What is agility? What is agile? And I mean, I like to use the British pronunciation of it, by the way. Some people say agile, but the Brits say agile, and so I kind of like that one.
And they did invent the English language, so
they did. So I prefer to use the Queen's English when I say agile. And so in this paper, I try to make some distinctions between the two in terms of agility, kind of writ large, thinking about what does it mean to be nimble as a leader, as a team, as an organization, and then talking about some more specific methods and practices which kind of fall into this bucket of activities that we call agile. So I think starting kind of with this idea of agility, this is fundamentally about being able to sense and respond to your environment quickly. And we can think of this as a capability that you can have either as an organization, as a team, or as an individual leader. And it's kind of a tough thing to look at from a research standpoint because there are all these different kind of levels of analysis going on there, right? So you study something at the organizational level that's a little bit different from the team level than from the individual leader level. And, from a psychological standpoint, a lot of this work has been done kind of at the individual level. So looking at what's called adaptive performance. And there's a well-known study that looked at this and kind of determined that there are a handful of competencies that are involved with adaptability at work at the individual level. So things like handling emergencies, handling work stress, solving problems creatively, dealing with uncertain situations, learning new work tasks, technologies, procedures, interpersonal adaptability, cultural adaptability, and even physically oriented adaptability. So this is kind of a framework for which we can understand some of this adaptive performance stuff at the individual or leader level, what helps people be successful in a more VUCA type of environment.
Yeah, and then let's clarify something here just a little bit. So, like, everybody talks about, hey, is your company Agile, bro? Do you even Agile? I Agiled yesterday,
I had an Agile shake yesterday.
There you go. Anytime something kind of comes into the forefront of the business community or even larger organizational community, quickly consultants are going to come in and like, well, how do we like codify this and monetize the fire out of it, right? So like with agility, like how we think about it is this is kind of how the organization's able to respond to its broader environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
absolutely.
But there's a difference, right, between agility and agile, right? Agile, I mean, I don't know. Do you say big A, agile with a big A?
Yeah, I do. Just to kind of make that distinction, when we're using agile as a noun, because it kind of refers to this entire set of methods and practices that we'll talk about here in a moment. Agility is that capability that you can have at either the individual, the team, or the organization level. And it's essentially, again, about sensing and responding to change quickly. And, that's a capability you can have. It's something you can build over time. And one way that you can do that is, or at least you can start to get there, is through some of these agile practices, at least kind of as a way to get started. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And so let's talk about Agile a little bit. A lot of people who are super familiar with that come from some kind of technology organization, although it's definitely spreading, and we help it spread, in fact, outside of software development companies alone. But a lot of people will say, oh, well, Agile, it got started with the Agile Manifesto, which is, some guys went up to a ski cabin and said, what's jacked up with software development? What's kind of a manifesto that might help guide a way to a better way? But it actually goes a lot earlier. You've got the extreme programming movement and this whole host of, I don't know, that's a whole episode on like the history of, stuff that emerged into Agile.
Well, even as you've talked about in the past, some of the stuff that comes not just from software, but from hardware and even in manufacturing, and some of those older methods, those have kind of a dose of Agile in them as well, right?
Yeah, so stuff like Kanban or Kanban, depending on which part of the country you're in, I suppose. But some of this stuff came from like the Toyota production methods and all of these kind of things. There's kind of nothing new under the sun, yet new ways of putting it together for people to kind of understand. Scrum's a popular framework. I know I was talking with a group of people outside of Atlanta that were talking, oh yeah, we're Agile because we Scrum, but like they can't even really speak to the larger issues of organizational agility because they're stuck in one paradigm of software development, and a lot of this stuff comes under the Agile stuff, which definitely helps you do software better. Even though that's kind of a broad continuum, and vigorous discussion happens at conferences all about doing Agile right or whatever that is. But here we really want to contrast that with agility. Agility being the sensing your environment and how to respond, and Agile being, really a body of techniques and stuff that you can use as a response to that VUCA environment, right?
Right. So I think it might be helpful for our listeners who maybe aren't as well versed or haven't been around this stuff before. If maybe you could just describe, and we could just pick one of the popular frameworks, which is or popular sets of practices, which is Scrum. And what is Scrum aside from a rugby thing where everybody's kind of wrestling together? What is it, and what does it kind of look like, and what does it involve?
Well, I mean, I'd say officially, Scrum is a set of stuff defined in the Scrum Guide. So, I mean, and I think they're pretty specific for it to be Scrum. It's got to be the Scrum Guide. So, it's really just a liturgy or a series of meetings that reflects and improves on everything you're doing. Right, time boxing, those kinds of things. So I definitely will put the Scrum Guide in the show notes for those of you that are interested. Also, a book we'll put in the show notes that's kind of describes that response or that practice.
Yeah. So it's a set of rituals or routines that a team can go through in order to better manage its workflow. And do so in a way that's more responsive and is very connected with what the end customer, the end user is going to be needing, right?
Right. So let's talk about some of these things like agility and Agile as a response to VUCA, right?
So, we have all this this turbulence in our environment. We have a lot of VUCA we're trying to deal with. One way that we can do that is certainly by sensing and responding to our environment better, being more responsive to changes, being more aware of those changes as they happen, trying to anticipate those changes before they happen. And, one way we can think about this is, some of the different ways that we can respond to the different pieces of VUCA. And, we can, I think there's some distinctions we need to make here, but there's an article that I'll put a link up to in the show notes that describes some of this. But, one way we can think about it is that, in terms of volatility, right, we need to have agility to deal with that. But sometimes I've found that, at least in the academic literature, people are oftentimes saying, well, agility is just this having lots of extra resources to throw at stuff in case things happen. Right? It's what we refer to as organizational slack, and I don't really see agility that way. Do you?
Well, no, because first of all, a leaner competitor is going to beat you if you have, just 50, 100, 1,000 people just sitting on the bench waiting to respond to something that may or may not happen that year. Like not many people have the balance sheet to even float that, right?
Right, exactly. So, I kind of actually see agility as a capability you can have as an organization, not just and it has to do with deep, cultural norms around how we behave, how we deal with risk, how we organize our teams, how we deal with failure, all those kinds of things. But I do think that, so in this article, and this is an article by Bennett and Lemoyne, it's called "What a Difference a Word Makes: Understanding Threats to Performance in a VUCA World." And these are two scholars, one at Georgia State University, one at Georgia Tech, and we'll put a link up to this. But they make a couple distinctions here, which I think are actually helpful. And one is that for example, with ambiguity, again, not really understanding what the right way is to go, where there's lots of plausible alternatives or plausible solutions to your problem. One way you can deal with that is through experimentation and trying things in a smart way in order to rule out different possibilities and try to figure out what's going to work. Has this been something that you've seen in some of the folks we've worked with?
Yeah. So, the whole idea is you've got to be able to, well, I don't know. You have a sensing function is what I call it. And I didn't invent that. I just forget where it's from. But you got to be able to sense the environment accurately. And then you need to have some kind of disciplined, governance way to respond. So one of the frameworks that I like to use is the Kinafin framework, or Kinafin, based on this guy named Snowden. No relation to the whistleblower guy, but we'll put a show note on the Kinafin framework. But you need to have a way in which you can run experiments. And those experiments need to first be based off in a culture that is both flexible in its organizational model and has a good amount of data collection and information that can help guide those directions.
Right. Yeah, and I think we'll definitely put up a nice explanation of the Kinafin framework that Snowden provides, because it's a good decision-making model or a sense-making model for how to identify what kind of situation you're in, and then due to based on the nature of the situation, that should guide your approach. Right? Is this an experiment type of approach, or is this or situation, or is this something where I can just apply best practice? That's what that can help you do. So maybe it'd be a good idea now to kind of move into, so we've talked about kind of what VUCA is, we've talked about agility and agile and tried to define those. Now we could move into maybe talking about some practical examples and some implications and kind of what this might mean in terms of what organizations can do to try to increase their agility. Sound good?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think that, so organizations, they focus like, hey, we need to go agile. And so they immediately leap to these techniques such as Scrum and just start, monkey see, monkey do, those behaviors. Like, okay, now this is a new process. It's more like a oh, we're changing our process. This is how you're going to fill out your time card, right? Well, this is how you're going to deliver projects. You're going to have a backlog and you're going to burn it down and those kinds of things. But really, those agile techniques need to nest, like we've been talking about, in that broader culture of agility. And what a lot of, not all, agile practitioners or consultants kind of lack is this organizational development, broader, holistic, the whole person kind of approach to what do we need to do as an organization to train and equip our people. What are the kind of attributes that our people inside our organizations need to have so that we can be an organization that moves with agility, that this becomes like part of our essence as a cohort of people trying to accomplish something. So in your paper, you talk about 8 specific areas. Ben, can we kind of walk through those briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first kind of way that we can, or implication that we can take from the research that I've done on agility is that you need to lead that push towards becoming more responsive, becoming more of a sensing organization, becoming more agile. You need to lead with why, right? And this kind of goes to the basic tenets of how change needs to be led within organizations, because this involves everyone. I think you kind of alluded to it before, where a lot of times when an organization says we're going to go agile, oftentimes it's just, hey, let's make some processes a little bit different in one area of the organization. Maybe it's your software folks who are going to do something a little bit different. That's usually what it means, and it's not. And it's a change in practices and some behaviors, and that's good. And it's not particularly easy, but it actually is easy when you contrast it with those deep things like culture and norms and expectations. Some of that stuff that's harder to see, but so much more impactful. And so I think you got to lead with why. And this is incumbent upon senior leadership to help to orient their employees, to help them understand why agility truly is a strategic imperative and what that means for them. And this is going to be a continual thing that leaders are going to have to reemphasize over and over again. Now, I think it's also important to emphasize that agility isn't, we contrasted earlier with, it's not just about having a whole bunch of extra resources. It's not, in our view, what we call organizational slack. And it's also not just reckless flexibility. I've come across some people who are like, oh, well, we need to be agile, so we're just going to chase every shiny thing, and the customer says this, so we shift immediately. That's not necessarily what we mean there. Have you come across any ways in which, how do you figure out that kind of middle ground?
Well, like when you're talking about lead with why, the challenge for that is senior management has to come up with a reason why. I mean, it's not like the people in your organization are your children and you can do a because I said so, kind of approach, right? You have to have why, which means you can't even get to that why without a clarified strategy. And maybe you even don't know why. And so the why is because we're conducting this experiment to learn this. And after that, we're going to come up with another why we're doing. And then, we can call it wheel spin or whatever. So, okay, well, we've got a reason why at the executive level. But then we go start talking to our mid-level management and down through the tiers in the organization. They don't know why. Like, why are we doing this? Well, because my annual performance review says I need to have 2 examples of teamwork. Right? That's not a very good example. So you actually have to not only lead with why, but you got to have some quality whys that are believable by people, that are worthwhile doing, right? So, so that why actually has to be real, and then that has to drive those kinds of behaviors within the organization. But Ben, what was the exact question?
Yeah. So how do you figure out that middle ground between agility and too much reckless flexibility?
Right. So the left and right limit is making sure that like, hey, what we're doing is related to this why, or this, kind of prime mover that we're going to organize around. So if you work at Amazon, well, why do you pack stuff into boxes? Because we have a customer promise, right? Of, prime 2-day shipping or whatever it is. So having a clear why, like, you'll never be able to dictate. The bigger the organization gets, although we see CEOs in these, 50 to 100 person organization that try to have a good handle on what everyone's doing, which shouldn't necessarily be so dictatorial, or however you want to say it, about those things. But if you have a clear vision of why, people can self-organize around everything that they do is related to kind of the goals of the organization, those why behaviors.
Right. Yeah, what I come back to is that it all has to be grounded in a well-developed organizational strategy and your vision, your mission, your values, right? Those are things that you would not be recklessly changing, right? It's about how do we continually execute those in the best way, and having a realistic, agile approach towards making sure that we're doing that on a continual basis, right? And I think some of this kind of comes back to an old idea and tool that we use in the military, and that's the idea of the commander's intent. So are you familiar with commander's intent, Chris?
Yes. Ad nauseum.
Ad nauseum. So what is the idea behind commander's intent? What is it about?
Well, like a good example for a commander's intent would be like to deny the enemy movement, right? And so your mission plan may be, hey, we're going to deny the enemy movement by blowing up a bridge. They won't be able to move. But let's say you don't have enough explosives or something, or, you get to the bridge and the explosives have, I don't know, rain has ruined them or something. These are bad examples, but maybe you could go put sugar in or salt into the gas tanks of the other side's vehicles, right?
Right.
So that is an example of, in the fog of war and the fog of business, you're not going to be able to foresee every single thing. But if you have a why or a commander's intent, right, people can figure out other ways to accomplish the same things through other means that are novel, unique, that you've never even thought of when you were making out the plan. And you'll never be able to plan stuff in this life that will take into account all of those things that just come up, right?
Yeah. And so you've got to actually make sure that everyone knows your intent. It's got to be a well thought out and well-developed intent. But it allows for individual decision-making at lower levels in the organization. It involves treating people like they're intelligent humans, not as semi-programmable robots.
And executives are mad all the time. Like, why are you guys so helpless? Where's the initiative? And they don't even realize that they've created that monster themselves through the way they communicate within the organization and not having compelling reasons around why, and a good way of developing those teams to kind of achieve that. Which, Ben, I think the second item from your paper was train agile behaviors, right?
Exactly.
So what's that mean?
So, what we've found is that most people and most organizations don't really know what agility looks like. And if you just, are kind of either drawing upon your own experience or just Googling around trying to get some information, or if you're, on LinkedIn, you're going to see a bunch of people who are like agile coaches and stuff, and kind of part of the, I have an acquaintance who calls it the agile industrial complex. There's this whole kind of world that's evolved around this whole thing, but it's all kind of segmented off in terms of, how do we do stuff kind of at a tactical level with software development teams and so forth. But one way in which organizations and leaders and teams can start to understand agility is through adopting some of these different techniques, right? Be it something like Scrum, or there's a whole host of other types of sets of practices and methods that can be helpful for the organization, or at least at the team level, to start to understand, okay, So maybe I need to approach planning in a different way. Maybe I need to approach prioritizing in a much more focused manner. Maybe I need to be more cognizant of the fact that when I have priorities set and somebody tries to interject a new one, that I need to talk to them about how that's going to affect my current plan, right? And so I think that these types of methods can be helpful to start to get people oriented around what agility might look like. And one part of Scrum that I particularly like, again, we mentioned that Scrum is kind of a set of different rituals and practices around project management and team behavior. And one thing that's a fairly prominent feature of Scrum is this idea of the retrospective. So at the end of a cycle of work called a sprint, the whole team gets together and talks about how we can operate better and how we can, it's basically a reflection on how the work gets done, how the team works together, with a real focus on improving both. And that requires a lot of trust. It requires openness and communication, and some good communication and feedback skills so that you can start to move forward and continually get better.
Yeah, right. So when we talk about training agile behaviors, people's like, oh, okay, well, that means we're going to do a sprint and we're going to have a retrospective. Actually, those are just like things that you do. Like an actual agile behavior is taking what we talk about in the retrospective where, you focus on how you do the work and those kinds of items that you actually incorporate your improves, which means you got to take some organizational time. It's not just about work, but it's actually spending time improving how we work together as a team, like specifically in the Scrum that focuses on people, processes, relationships, and tools. So an agile behavior is actually identifying the problem and daggone doing something about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's kind of what we call driving to done, right?
Right.
Absolutely. And that's a good segue into the third point, which is creating great teams. So we talked about leading with why, training those agile behaviors, and then creating great teams. And when I talk to organizations about the whole idea of teams and teamwork, the first thing you got to decide is whether or not a set of tasks are appropriate for a team. A lot of times we'll take things that are actually better suited for an individual to do, and we say this is a team activity, and that doesn't work well. Teams are best for tasks that are highly interdependent, that require interaction between people. And if that's the nature of the task, then a team is likely an appropriate way to attack that task. Now, when you're considering how to create that team, you need to select people who have the requisite skills and knowledge to contribute, and they also need to have a willingness to collaborate. So there's that interpersonal ability to work with other people. Also supporting an environment where everyone feels like they're valued, has a voice, can speak up, clarifying roles and team procedures. So oftentimes, when people talk about team building, they talk about, kind of cheesy stuff like doing trust falls and maybe going out in the wilderness for a while. And while those things might be fun and maybe might increase a sense of camaraderie through a shared experience, they're not necessarily going to lead to a great team. What I think can be oftentimes very helpful for a team is to simply have clarity about what the team needs to do, what its tasks are, what its critical tasks are, and then clarifying the roles and responsibilities. Who's going to do what here, and how are we going to get things done? And this may sound simple, but it's actually pretty hard, and it takes some effort. But I think that oftentimes if you do that, you're going to set yourself up for success. And the other part of creating good teams is providing the team with the resources in terms of time, space, other types of tools that it may need to get its job done. Teams, we do know from research that, teams that have a shared knowledge of kind of who has what knowledge, who can do what, and how we can communicate with each other, they tend to do much better, and they can sense and adapt much better than teams that don't have that.
Yeah, and all of this is just like a super cliff notes. There is just gobs and gobs of information around creating great teams that organizations, employees, and managers should all really look at on those teams. So, Ben, the next of the 8 areas is empowering decision making. We were talking earlier about, hey, by starting off with the why, decision making can happen at the lower levels. But what does that mean more broadly for the organization?
Yeah, so it means a couple of things. So first of all, when we use the word empower or empowerment, a lot of times executives, senior leaders can interpret that to be, well, I'll just tell people you are empowered. Go do it. That's not really what we mean here. What we mean here is about providing people with the frameworks, with the training, with the ability, and also giving people the authority to make decisions based upon their expertise. One thing that we know from some of the research on what we call high reliability organizations, which are organizations like naval aircraft carriers and nuclear power plants and so forth, is that they're working with high risk technologies very frequently, but they have many fewer mistakes or accidents than we would expect, less than their fair share. And one reason for that is that they drive decision-making down to the level of expertise. They defer decision-making authority to those who have the most expertise, so that, on that naval aircraft carrier, someone who's out on the flight deck and finds something wrong, some really low-ranking person, they have the authority and the ability to stop the entire operation. Right. And that's just an example of kind of allowing expertise and authority, to really drive who has the authority there. And this can help because, you oftentimes will have people in organizations who are perhaps lower level. Maybe they have more interaction with the customer or with the technology, and they actually have a better insight in terms of what's going wrong or what potential opportunities there are. So you really have to create an environment and a culture in which people feel like they can truly have a voice and make a difference, regardless of their position in the kind of formal hierarchy.
Right, and this isn't in a black and white scenario. So if you've been in an organization where it's really command and control, and you say, "Hey, we want more organizational agility," okay, guys, you all get to decide now, right? You are empowered, and actually now you make all the decision. Well, you can't go cold turkey. Maybe some people aren't the best people to be making those decisions. Maybe they need coaching on how to communicate. There's a whole host of things that you'd want to address before doing that. But as a knowledgeable manager who knows how to create teams, train agile behaviors, have a good definition of why, you can start to move towards that more empowered side of the spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, that kind of leads us into the next one, which is support agile behaviors. So, we've talked about lead with why, train agile behaviors, create great teams, empower decision-making, and then you've got to support that behavior. And that's because, and this kind of ties into the last one, which is promoting an agile culture, but oftentimes these behaviors can, as you already alluded to, Chris, they fly in the face of traditional hierarchy. If you're deferring decision-making authority to those people who have the most expertise, and those people may not be people who have a lot of organizational power, that's going to be different, in terms of how decision-making happens, how communication flows, than maybe you're used to in a normal hierarchy. So,
well, yeah, as a manager, you're judged, right? You're just like, okay, well, now Williamson is going to come speak about what his team is doing. Well, what if one of the people on his team saw something and was able to directly communicate that to the VP, who then socialized it? Well, a lot of managers would feel like, hey, everything needs to go through me. And sometimes that's an appropriate behavior, but it definitely slows down your organizational agility. Is it worth that slowdown? Those are things that you're going to have to take a look at. So supporting agile behavior might be saying, hey, I'm glad you went ahead and told the VP that. That's great. And that VP would have the, knowledge to, weigh what was being said and what the appropriate response with that information would be.
Absolutely. And so you've got to support those types of behaviors, both kind of formally and informally. Embedding, for example, some elements of these behaviors into, for example, job descriptions and performance appraisals and informal performance feedback. Those can be ways in which senior level leaders can really start to support agile behavior and show people that, no, I really do, support, expect, and reward these types of behaviors from our people.
Right. And you look at a lot of these annual reviews, it's like, okay, increase productivity by 4%. Okay, excellent. But how was it operated? How would you evaluate? This would be where the cultural or paradigm shift would be. How in your annual or quarterly reviews or however you do that process, would you talk about how this person worked as a team or helped foster better team interactions? How about communication? This person was transparent and communicated what was going on every step of the way. Those would be like some structural supports beyond the kind of the soft supports for those agile behaviors.
Yes, absolutely. And so that kind of leads us into this next one, which is iterating towards better. A big part of being agile, just by definition, is the idea that you're continually receiving feedback and trying to improve based upon it. And this could be, at the kind of product development level. It's, we're putting stuff in front of customers and we're quickly integrating their responses to it into our iterations towards making something better, moving that 1.0 to a 2.0 version, all that kind of stuff. But it also has to do with, other things throughout the organization. It could be, your processes that you're putting in place. It could be, the feedback that's occurring within a team on different behaviors that are more or less helpful. And so, there has to be a kind of this idea of a growth mindset. And this is having the belief that people can and will and do change and improve over time. And sometimes this is where you kind of get what you are expecting in terms of it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I expect that, or if I believe truly that I can change, that the people around me can change, and we can all improve, then we're probably going to see some of that. If I truly believe that, everyone's behavior is fixed and we aren't able to improve, then I'm probably going to get that too. So this is about having that mindset towards continual improvement, and trying to incorporate feedback about performance and about quality into your decision making about what you're going to focus upon in order to continually improve.
Yeah, and if you're iterating towards better, actually iterating towards better rather than just talking about getting better, your organization is going to evolve and change in ways you can't even imagine that are for the positive. And that, like we talk about, are more responsive to that VUCA environment.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And then we talk about iterating towards better. One of those things is like evaluate organizational structure. Now, iterating towards better may be changing how your organization is set up. Evaluating that. That's one of those things where it's not a either or, a black or white, like, okay, now I'm going to sit down and master plan what our org chart looks like next year. But it's not, all right, guys, depending on the environment, obviously, but all right, guys, you tell us how to organize. There's a little bit of handshake between both.
Right. And so, figuring out what your org chart is going to look like it's kind of org charts in and of themselves are kind of a blunt instrument. It's kind of a mechanistic type of approach towards an organization overall. It's kind of having this idea that an organization is a machine and that people are, in these set roles and stuff. And it's comforting, I think, for some managers and for people to say, okay, here's where I sit and so forth. But in reality, you take any org chart, I guarantee you that a lot of the work that happens in the white space on the organizational chart, not necessarily on those little lines and through the boxes and so forth, as you may imagine, right?
Yeah, one of the best examples of that is what I call the Excel weenie role. Now, you go into these like larger organizations, and a lot of the different departments or sections will have, they'll call them an analyst, coordinator, project manager. But then when you talk to them about what do you do in your day to day? Oh, I do the Excel for the group. I generate the reporting, which they should just actually make a career path for the Excel weenies of the world. I've definitely been one earlier in my career, but that's an example where the org chart even speaks specifically to the duties, role, and responsibilities. And, people will go to those job interviews and they're all ready for a project management role, but then they say, okay, well, what will I be doing day to day? And it's crunching Excel, and that's it. So even if you design the perfect org chart, like you said, all this work happens in the white space. Well, here's an example of the person's not even doing the work that's listed in the org chart. And that's how things will happen and people will self-organize. Another piece of that white space is how are these groups, because there's tasks and demands that will happen that come from the environment that require the people to work what they call cross-functionally. Now, people will talk about, we have a matrixed organization and all this kind of stuff, but there's still this idea of I have to work with somebody that doesn't write my performance review and actually have a bit of a remit to do something in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about organizational structure, I think about, you need to take a close look at how communication flow actually happens in your organization. In order, how are people actually getting work done? Who do they normally talk to? How do they interact? And that's really how you should be organizing. And having an element of self-organization there is very important, and providing people that flexibility. I mean, you could have kind of a notional org chart, and then just have the kind of an expectation that, hey, it's okay if people don't always communicate, up and over to, through their supervisor and over to another supervisor and then back down. Direct communication is okay.
If you want to be more agile, right?
Yes, absolutely. If you do. And that kind of ties into this last one, which is promoting an agile culture. And, we mentioned this earlier, this is hard. It's a very difficult thing. Culture in and of itself is a deep set of norms. It's kind of the personality of the organization. It's kind of, the way things get done around here. And, if you only try to attempt, becoming more agile through adopting a couple new techniques or trying to, make one part of the organization, one team more agile, holding a training session, that's not really going to work, right? It may change a few things here and there, but you need to have that culture and that mindset, which is about how do we approach risk? How are decisions made? What are the appropriate ways for us to communicate within the organizational structure? Those types of things, right? And some of those values and norms like, deep interpersonal respect combined with candor and transparency, collaborating with people. I think a deep sense of humility is important.
Right.
Leaders have to be willing in an agile environment to accept the fact that they don't know everything, and that's not leadership's job to know everything. That some of their best sensing and best responding may happen at very, at lower levels in the organization. Having certainly a deep respect for and involvement with your customer, understanding why you exist and how you're continually adapting to fit their needs is very important, as well as kind of the idea of continuous learning. So those are just some aspects of an agile culture. But if you ignore that piece, then what you're going to have is kind of a part of the organization that's trying to do things in a more agile way. They're going to get frustrated with the rest of the organization that's not working that way. And eventually, you put a team or a person in a culture that is contrary to kind of how they operate, the culture is going to win.
Yeah, there's always a vortex of culture that eats everything out. So right. the idea of promoting an agile culture means it's not and now we're agile. There's not an arrival. There's more of the destination isn't the goal. It's the journey type thing. And
yeah.
And that means as senior leaders, you're going to have to adopt different behaviors, practices, and those kinds of ideas. And then you're going to have to encourage and reward that out of people within the organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, just to recap those 8 different implications for how organizations and people and teams can become more agile. It's lead with why, train agile behaviors, create great teams, empower decision making, support agile behavior, iterate toward better, evaluate organizational structure, promote an agile culture. And these are all described in a little bit more detail in the white paper that we'll post in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. So let's take a look at what this means for senior leaders, mid-level managers, and if you're just, a lay employee at the organization, let's kind of just go through some quick bullet points on, hey, now that we've talked through VUCA, some of the ways in which we can deal with VUCA, how should we respond at these different levels of the organization? So if you're a senior leader, what are a couple things that we might want to consider?
Yeah, first thing is you got to look in the mirror. Your solution and your problem is probably staring right back at you. We oftentimes get called into organizations to help them become more agile, and it's like fix everything else in my organization, but I don't want to change.
Yes, you can do anything you want, just not with me.
Exactly. It just doesn't work, right? That role modeling is absolutely critical. Senior leaders also have to be okay with relinquishing some of their control, right? They need to be able to develop and then delegate and empower decision-making at lower levels in the organization. And a lot of this ties back into these norms and these values that they're trying to promote that really start to feed into a culture of agility.
Right. So, your effectiveness as a senior leader, if you treat everybody as your arms and legs, is just going to be as fast as you are, which stuff we've learned from Wikipedia. Yes, you're right. The Encyclopedia Britannica had a better editorial team, but the impact and scope of Wikipedia is so much more massive. Not that there's not a role for each in society and the world in your organization, but if you're able to model those agile behaviors, relinquish control appropriately, which doesn't mean like, oh, well, it's, and again, looking at yourself in the mirror, making sure that you're following good practice as far as relinquish control. Don't hand over the power plant to the accountants per se.
Right.
And if you're developing that culture, that's an agile culture, you're going to have a big impact, way more than if you command and control everything to death.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
So mid-level managers, Ben.
Yeah, so I think a couple things that you got to do as a mid-level manager is, if you're being empowered with decision-making, you've got to take ownership, and, that can feel different. You've also got to become much more comfortable working across the normal organizational boundaries, overcoming some of the natural tendencies we have to defend and guard our turf. We oftentimes get kind of defensive, and we like to have our corners of the organization. Well, we've got to be able to work across those different differences. And then I think another thing that mid-managers need to do is they need to really become curators of teams. They need to help to have teams that flourish, promoting some of the behaviors that we know really makes good teams, and allowing for some of the self-organization that is happening. Don't necessarily fight it, right? If there's good self-organizing that's happening, even encourage it and figure out ways in which it can be promoted and made even more useful.
Yeah, I think the term of coach is better here. A coach of a baseball team doesn't go up to bat. Right. But a coach maybe decides the order of at-bats, right? Which means those mid-level managers need to become, as much as they can, experts on those, all that great team literature and how to implement and coach and develop that within an organization.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the lower level employee, which that sounds so horrible. So, but if
it does,
if you don't manage anybody, so that could be a high level subject matter expert, like maybe you're a .NET guru or something like that. But if you're somebody that doesn't necessarily have organizational authority, what are some of those behaviors and practical examples of how to operate in these environments?
Yeah, so I think one of them is that you always have the ability, especially if you have a high degree of expertise within your organization, you always have the ability to manage up. And, by actually talking with your manager, your supervisor, about the types of things you're trying to do, trying to sell new ways of doing things to them, and being an advocate for new ways and better ways of doing things. I think you can also, earn some additional autonomy in your role by demonstrating competence. Get good at stuff that the organization needs. That's a really great way for you to start to increase your organizational power, because once you start demonstrating that, people are going to start to look to you as an expert on things. If you're the Excel weenie, by golly, become the best one that you can, right? And people will come to you, and you'll be able to start crafting your job in a much more agile manner. And also, I think you can also learn some of these decision-making skills and demonstrate some good decision-making. Have a more collaborative type of approach towards solving problems, even at a lower level within the organization.
All right, Ben. So wrapping up, flourishing in a VUCA world, agile, agility, and why it matters. So let's recap VUCA. What are the 4 VUCA elements?
Yep. So it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity,
which we all see in everywhere. And I think the key takeaway here is organizational agility is the best response to VUCA. You can't be, if you survive VUCA by being a stick in the mud, it's just the lemming approach. You by accident are surviving right now. So Key point, organizational agility is the best practice for thriving that. Agile is some of the processes and behaviors, not just agile project management, which most people tend to focus on, but some of these agile processes are the best ways or some of the good ways that we've discovered to start supporting organizational agility. So, Ben, is this stuff just a fad?
Yeah, I don't really think so. I think agility has actually been important for a very long time, but is increasingly more important as we deal with rapid technological advancement, increased globalization. I think it is becoming even more important to not just manage change, but to continually sense and respond to change in this more agile way.
Yeah, and not the fearmonger at all, but if you're in a organization or industry rather that isn't super competitive, well, you can get away with a lot less of these behaviors. But more and more and more, people find that there's not a corner of the earth that is a safe spot or a less competitive industry. So the key to flourishing here is to learn about these ideas around teams, agility, agile, and embrace them now so you're ready for when that change comes.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the more rewarding aspects of helping organizations become more agile, for me, has been seeing the flourishing that happens at the individual level when you start to operate this way. This is actually a much more human way of organizing. It's highly engaging from a psychological standpoint. Being able to see the products of your work more rapidly, feeling like you matter within the organization. So, there are some aspects of Agile and agility that are perhaps unfamiliar to folks, but once you start doing this stuff, it is a truly transformative experience and can help you flourish at the individual level, in addition to helping the organization flourish in a VUCA world. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.